The city lights flickered in the night, glowing across the empty streets where life moved fast but hearts often remained cold. Daniel Harper, a 34-year-old man who spent most of his time buried in his work, never imagined that one evening would change everything he believed about humanity. He had no family nearby, no deep friendships left, and his job in a large corporate firm left him exhausted every day. To him, emotions had become a distant memory, something he read about but no longer felt. One Friday evening, as he sat in his car outside a charity auction event his company had sponsored, he scrolled through his phone absent-mindedly. It wasn't the kind of event he enjoyed, full of people pretending to care about causes they didn't understand. He wanted to leave early, but his manager insisted he stay until the end. That's when the host's voice echoed from the stage inside, announcing something that made him lift his head. Tonight, we are supporting victims of human neglect, young women who have survived harsh lives, now seeking a second chance through our rehabilitation program, the announcer said. Daniel sighed and stepped inside, clapping politely as people around him cheered. It all felt staged, until his eyes fell on one of the women standing silently near the back. She didn't move or smile like the others. Her hair fell across her face, her posture small and fragile. She looked out of place, almost invisible to everyone else. He didn't know why, but something in her expression, a mixture of strength and pain, caught his attention. When the bidding for symbolic sponsorships began, people donating funds to help survivors rebuild their lives, Daniel, almost without thinking, raised his hand. He didn't even hear the number he offered. All he knew was that when the auctioneer said, "Sold," the woman lifted her head slightly and looked at him. For a second, their eyes met. Hers were deep brown, tired, but still alive. Later that evening, when the event ended, Daniel was told that the woman he had sponsored was named Elena. The program coordinator asked if he wanted to meet her briefly. Daniel hesitated but agreed. They met in a quiet hallway behind the event hall. Elena stood still, her hands clasped together, eyes avoiding his. The air was heavy with silence until she finally spoke, her voice soft but steady. "You bought me," she said quietly. "Do what you will." "Then end it," Daniel froze. For a moment he thought he'd misheard her. There was no emotion in her voice, no anger, no fear, just emptiness. He tried to find words, but nothing came out. "I didn't buy you," he finally said, his voice low. "It was a donation to help you start again." She lifted her gaze slightly, confusion flickering for a moment. "Start again?" she repeated. "There's nothing left to start." The way she said it sent a strange ache through him. Her tone wasn't dramatic, and it was honest, almost factual, like someone who had already accepted that life had taken everything away from her. Daniel didn't know what to say. He wanted to ask her what she'd been through, but something told him that wasn't the right question. Instead, he said, "Maybe there's more left than you think." Elena gave a faint, almost sad smile, the kind that hides more tears than it shows. She thanked him politely and left with the group of women heading back to their shelter. But Daniel couldn't forget her words. They replayed in his head again and again that night. "You bought me. Do what you will, then end it." Those words haunted him. He had met hundreds of people through his work, clients, partners, employees, but none had spoken to him with such hopeless certainty. Something inside him refused to let it go. The next day, he called the charity office asking about the rehabilitation program. The woman on the phone explained that Elena had joined only a few weeks ago. She was quiet, distant, and barely interacted with others. She had refused counseling, refused to share her past, and seemed to believe she didn't deserve a future. Daniel asked if he could volunteer at the center. The woman sounded surprised. Most sponsors never did. But after a pause, she agreed. When Daniel visited the center for the first time, he found it peaceful but heavy. The women there were trying to rebuild themselves, some painting, some learning skills, some just sitting silently. Elena was sitting alone in the corner of the garden, reading a small, worn-out book. He walked up slowly, not wanting to startle her. "You like reading?" he asked gently. She looked up, unsure if she should respond. "It helps me forget," she said after a pause. Daniel sat on the bench across from her. "Maybe books don't help us forget," he said. "Maybe they help us remember we're not alone." For the first time, Elena looked at him properly. There was curiosity in her eyes. Not trust yet, but something small and fragile. Days turned into weeks. Daniel began visiting the center regularly, helping with small things, fixing shelves, bringing books, talking to the women. But without realizing it, most of his attention always went toward Elena. He never asked about her past, never pushed her to speak. Instead, he talked about little things, stories from his travels, moments from his work, even funny mistakes he made. Sometimes she listened silently, sometimes she smiled faintly. One rainy afternoon, while they watched raindrops slide down the window, Elena finally spoke more than a few words. "You don't have to come here," she said softly. "I know," he replied. "But I want to." She looked away. "Why?" Daniel hesitated, then said, "Because I think you've been hurt enough by people who didn't see you. I just don't want to be another one." Her eyes glistened for a moment before she blinked them clear. "You think people can change?" she asked. He nodded. "I think people can heal. Maybe not completely, but enough to live again." That evening, after Daniel left, Elena stayed in the garden long after dark. She thought about his words. Nobody had spoken to her like that in years. Not as a case to fix, not as a mistake, but as a person who still mattered. A week later, Daniel brought her a small gift, a sketchbook. "I heard you used to draw," he said with a smile. Elena stared at it for a moment before opening the cover. Her hands trembled slightly. "I haven't touched a pencil in years," she whispered. "Then maybe it's time to try again," he said. She looked at him uncertain, but something inside her shifted. That night, alone in her room, she drew for the first time in years. Not perfectly, not confidently, but honestly. As the weeks went by, her walls began to crack. She started joining group activities, sometimes helping other women. She spoke softly, but more often. Daniel noticed small changes. The way her voice no longer carried only sadness. The way her eyes sometimes caught the sunlight. But one afternoon, he arrived at the center to find her gone. Panic filled him until the coordinator explained that she had gone to visit the small market nearby for the first time alone. It was part of her healing process. He smiled with relief, until the coordinator added, "It's the first time she's ever stepped outside the gate without fear." That night, Daniel sat in his car realizing something he hadn't before, that his own life had begun to change too. Elena had reminded him what it meant to care, to feel, to believe in something again. But deep inside, he knew there was something about her past he still didn't know, something she hadn't said, and soon he would find out. And it would shatter everything he thought he understood about pain, hope, and love. Weeks passed quietly after Elena's small step toward freedom. The women at the center noticed how she changed little by little. She began smiling at others, joining their morning walks, even sharing tea with them. Daniel continued visiting, though he tried not to make his presence heavy. He didn't want her to feel watched, only supported. Every time he saw her sketchbook filled slowly with new drawings, it felt like watching someone rebuild their soul piece by piece. But one thing still puzzled him, the sadness that sometimes returned to her eyes when she thought no one was looking. It was like a cloud that passed briefly but never truly left. One afternoon, as autumn began to touch the trees, Daniel found Elena sitting on the same bench in the garden where they had first spoken. She was holding an envelope in her hands. Her fingers traced its edges again and again. "I've been thinking," she said softly before he could even greet her. "There's something I need to tell you." Daniel sat beside her, careful not to interrupt. "You once said people can heal," she continued. "Maybe you're right. But healing means facing the truth, doesn't it?" He nodded. "Yes, the truth is part of healing." Elena took a deep breath. "Then you deserve to know mine." Her voice was calm, but her hands trembled. She looked ahead at the fading sunlight, not at him. "I came here after being found by the charity workers at a railway station. I had been living there for months. Not because I wanted to, but because I had nowhere else to go. My parents died when I was young. I was raised by relatives who never really cared. When I turned 18, I left home thinking I could make it on my own. But the world wasn't kind." She paused, her eyes far away. "People promised help, but they only wanted to use my pain. Every time I trusted someone, I ended up more broken than before. When I said that night, 'You bought me, do what you will, then end it,' it wasn't because of you. It was because I thought that's all people ever wanted from me, to use me and then forget I existed." Daniel felt a lump in his throat. He didn't speak. He didn't want to interrupt her courage. But that night, she went on, when you said you didn't buy me and that simple sentence, it changed something inside me. Nobody had ever said that before. Nobody had ever refused to treat me like an object. You didn't ask for anything in return. You just stayed. And that confused me. I kept waiting for the moment you'd stop caring. But you didn't. She turned to look at him then, her eyes shining with tears. I don't know why you did it, Daniel. But you made me believe that maybe I'm still human, that maybe I can live again. Daniel felt something in his chest tighten. He wanted to tell her that she didn't need to thank him, that she had done the hardest part herself, choosing to trust again. But he stayed quiet, letting her speak. Elena opened the envelope slowly and handed it to him. Inside was a sketch, a drawing of two people sitting under a tree. One was looking down, lost, while the other simply sat beside them, not touching, not speaking, just being there. That's us, she said with a small smile. I wanted to give you this before I leave. He blinked, surprised. Leave? What do you mean? I've been accepted into an art program in another city, she said softly. It's for people who've come through trauma and are trying to rebuild their lives through creativity. The charity helped me apply. Daniel felt a strange mix of pride and sadness. That's wonderful, Elena, he said, forcing a smile. You deserve it. She looked down at her hands. I'm scared, she admitted. But I think it's time. For so long, I lived thinking my story was already over. Now, maybe it's just beginning, he nodded slowly. You're right. It is just beginning. The garden fell silent for a while, filled only by the sound of wind brushing through the leaves. Daniel, she said finally, you once said you didn't want to be another person who hurt me. You weren't. You became the reason I learned that kindness still exists. You didn't fix me, but you helped me start fixing myself. He smiled faintly, but his heart ached. I didn't do much. You did enough, she whispered. A few days later, the center held a small farewell gathering for Elena. She looked different that day, wearing a light blue dress, her hair tied back neatly, and her eyes full of quiet strength. The other women hugged her, some crying, some smiling proudly. Daniel stood a little apart, watching her talk to the group. When she finally came to him, she handed him another envelope. This is for you, she said. He opened it after she left. Inside was a short note written in her careful handwriting. You once said people can heal even if not completely. You were right. Healing isn't about forgetting the past. It's about believing the future can be different. Thank you for seeing me when I was invisible. Elena. Daniel read it twice, then folded it carefully and kept it in his wallet. Weeks turned into months. Life went back to its ordinary rhythm. Work, meetings, deadlines, all the things that once filled Daniel's days. But something had changed inside him. He no longer felt empty. He had started volunteering regularly, helping more people at the center. He said little about it at work, but every evening he looked forward to that quiet time helping others rediscover hope. One afternoon, about 6 months later, a letter arrived at the charity office addressed to him. It was from Elena. She wrote that she was doing well, that she had exhibited her first set of drawings. The local newspaper had even written a small story about her. She said the sketches were inspired by moments of silence, by people who stay, even when they don't know what to say. At the end of the letter, she wrote, Sometimes I still remember that night when I said, You bought me, do what you will, then end it. Now, if I could meet that version of myself, I would tell her, You were wrong. You weren't bought, you were found. Daniel read those words slowly, his eyes wet with emotion. He smiled, whispering to himself, You found yourself, Elena. That evening he went to the garden again, the same bench where it all began. The city was quiet, the air cool. He looked at the empty seat beside him and felt a peaceful warmth inside. He realized then that sometimes life brings two broken souls together not to fix each other, but to remind one another that being broken doesn't mean being beyond repair. Elena had healed, but in her healing she had also healed a part of him. Years later, Daniel would still keep her drawing framed on his wall, the one with two people under the tree. Every time he looked at it, he remembered what she taught him, that kindness can reach places even love can't, and that hope often begins with a single act of seeing someone when the world refuses to. In the end, Daniel didn't just sponsor a stranger, he witnessed a rebirth. And Elena didn't just find freedom, she found the meaning of being alive again. Their paths drifted apart with time, but the connection remained unsilent, real, and eternal in the heart. Because some stories aren't about romance or rescue, they're about recognition. The recognition that a soul once lost can still shine, when someone simply chooses to see it.